The landlords thought they owned the land. What they didn't realize was that one day the people living on it would decide they no longer cared. In the late 1870s, across rural Ireland, something quiet began to change. There was no war declaration, no marching armies, no sudden revolution. Instead, there was silence rent payments that stopped arriving, doors that no longer opened, and a growing feeling that power was slipping away from those who believed it was permanent. For generations, the system had been simple. Large landowners controlled vast estates, while tenant families worked the land and paid rent to stay on it. The arrangement was unequal but familiar. Landlords expected loyalty or at least obedience. Tenants expected hardship but survival. Everyone understood their place. This stability, however fragile, created a dangerous illusion that the system could continue forever. Then economics turned against everyone. Bad harvests, falling crop prices, and economic pressure made life unbearable for many tenant farmers. Potatoes failed, markets weakened. Families that were already living on the edge found themselves unable to pay full rent. At first, tenants hoped the situation would improve. Landlords expected temporary delays. Both sides believed normal life would return. But when hardship lasts too long, patience becomes resentment. Landowners faced a choice they didn't recognize as a turning point. They could reduce rents, negotiate, and adapt to changing conditions. They could enforce old rules with the confidence that authority alone would protect them. Most chose the second option. From their perspective, rent was not optional. It was the foundation of ownership. If they showed weakness once, they feared the entire system would collapse. What they underestimated was psychology. When people feel they have nothing left to lose, fear loses its power. Tenants began talking quietly among themselves. They shared stories of evictions, of families thrown out during winter, of landlords who refused compromise. Anger grew not as sudden rage, but as shared understanding. This shift mattered more than any single event. Once individuals see their problems as collective, resistance becomes possible. The idea was simple. If everyone acted together, landlords could not punish everyone at once. The first resistance did not look dramatic. It looked ordinary. Meetings in small halls, conversations after church, quiet agreements to stand together. Leaders encouraged tenants to avoid violence and instead use social pressure. The strategy was psychological rather than physical. Instead of attacking landlords directly, they would isolate them. This tactic would soon become famous through a single word: boycott. The term came from Captain Charles Boycott, a land agent who refused to reduce rents and attempted to evict tenants. Instead of fighting him, the local community simply stopped interacting with him. Workers refused to harvest his crops. Shops refused to serve him. Laborers avoided his fields. Even mail carriers hesitated. He was not attacked, he was ignored. And that silence became more powerful than violence. For landlords watching this unfold, the threat felt unfamiliar. They understood riots, they understood rebellion. They did not understand social isolation. Authority depends on cooperation, even reluctant cooperation. When entire communities withdrew that cooperation, ownership felt strangely empty. Fear spread among landowners. Stories circulated of estates where workers vanished overnight. Crops rotted because no one would harvest them. Reputation became a new form of currency, and once damaged, it was difficult to recover. Some landlords doubled down, ordering evictions to reassert control. Others felt pressure but hesitated, unsure how to respond to a movement that avoided direct confrontation. Meanwhile, tenants gained confidence. For the first time, many felt protected, not by laws, but by numbers. Women played a major role in this early phase, organizing communities, spreading information, and reinforcing social pressure. Their participation strengthened the movement because it made resistance feel like daily life rather than open rebellion. What made this moment historically powerful was not violence, but restraint. The movement understood something landlords did not yet see. Power is not just legal ownership, it is social acceptance. Once acceptance fades, authority weakens quickly. Landowners began to realize that the old tools eviction notices, legal threats, displays of dominance were losing effectiveness. Evict one family and neighbors stepped in. Enforce one rule too harshly and entire communities turned against you. The system was changing faster than many could understand. This is where the first lesson appears. The landlords who ignored early warning signs saw resistance as temporary. They believed pressure would fade, that tenants would eventually submit out of necessity. But necessity had shifted. Survival now depended on cooperation among tenants, not obedience to landlords. Part 1 of the Irish Land War is not about open conflict. It is about the moment before power realizes it is weakening the quiet phase where assumptions still feel safe, even as reality moves beneath them. Landowners thought betrayal came suddenly. In truth, it arrived slowly, through conversations, shared frustration, and collective decision-making. By the time many landlords recognized what was happening, the rules had already changed. And the real battle, the one that would decide who adapted and who collapsed, had only just begun. The moment landlords realized something was wrong, it was already too late to stop easily. The resistance had spread beyond individual villages and turned into a movement with shared tactics, shared language, and shared confidence. Rent was no longer just money, it had become a symbol of power. And when symbols change meaning, control becomes fragile. At first, many landowners responded with the methods they had always used. Eviction notices were sent. Legal pressure increased. Some hired outside workers to replace tenants who refused cooperation. On paper, these steps looked strong. In reality, they exposed how dependent landlords were on the very people they were trying to control. Fields cannot be harvested without labor. Estates cannot function without community participation. Ownership alone does not produce results. The strategy of isolation grew stronger. When a landlord or agent refused negotiation, tenants did not attack, they withdrew. Workers refused employment. Shopkeepers stopped selling goods. Neighbors avoided conversation. Even those who privately disagreed with the movement often participated out of fear of being isolated themselves. Social pressure proved more effective than force. This was psychological warfare without violence, and it confused the ruling class. One of the most famous examples centered around land agent Charles Boycott. His name would become a word used worldwide, but at the time, his experience felt like a warning to every landowner in Ireland. Nothing physical was taken from him. Instead, everyday life became impossible. Crops stood unharvested because no one would work. Deliveries stopped. Isolation turned authority into helplessness. Landowners watching this realized something deeply unsettling. Power could be ignored into irrelevance. Fear spread quickly among estate owners. Letters circulated describing abandoned fields, rising costs, and growing hostility. Some landlords believed the government would crush the movement. Others hoped it would fade naturally. But the problem was not just economic, it was emotional. Tenants no longer saw landlords as inevitable. That psychological shift was the real threat. Authorities attempted to intervene. Police protected eviction attempts, troops escorted workers in some areas. Yet these actions often backfired. Every forced eviction created more sympathy for tenants and more resentment toward landlords. Images of families removed from homes fueled outrage. Resistance expanded because people saw themselves reflected in the struggle. Inside the landlord class, divisions began to appear. Some insisted on strict enforcement. They believed compromise showed weakness and encouraged rebellion. Others quietly started reducing rents or negotiating new terms. These landlords understood something important. Survival required adaptation. The old system was cracking, and rigid control could accelerate collapse. The difference between these approaches became clear quickly. Landlords who tried to rule through fear found themselves isolated, financially strained, and socially targeted. Their costs increased as they paid for security and replacement workers. Estates lost productivity. Reputation suffered. In a world where public opinion was shifting, image mattered more than many realized. Meanwhile, those who negotiated early often regained stability. By lowering rents or easing pressure, they reduced tension and maintained cooperation. They lost short-term income but preserved long-term control. This was a difficult lesson. Flexibility looked like weakness in the moment, but proved to be strength over time. For tenants, success reinforced unity. The movement grew more organized. Leaders emphasized discipline, encouraging resistance without chaos. But women continued playing a central role organizing support, maintaining community communication, and strengthening social enforcement. Their presence made the movement feel normal, almost domestic, rather than revolutionary. That normalization made it harder to suppress. Psychologically, the conflict entered a new phase. It was no longer about immediate survival. It was about dignity. Tenants wanted security and fairness. Landowners wanted authority preserved. Both sides believed they were protecting their future. This clash of identity made compromise difficult. As months passed, financial pressure mounted on landlords. Empty land meant lost income. Legal battles were expensive. Political attention grew. Newspapers outside Ireland began covering the conflict, turning local struggles into international stories. Public opinion slowly shifted toward the tenants, increasing pressure on those who refused change. Some landowners began selling property altogether, deciding the risk was no longer worth the stress. Others held on stubbornly, convinced the system would eventually restore itself. This refusal to adapt would cost many of them dearly. Part 2 of this story is about betrayal, but not the kind landlords expected. They felt betrayed by their tenants, by the government, even by society itself. But the deeper betrayal was their own belief that power could stay unchanged while the world around it transformed. The Irish Land War revealed a truth that history repeats often: when authority depends on cooperation. Breaking that cooperation changes everything. The landlords who understood this began adjusting their approach. The ones who didn't continued fighting a battle that had already moved beyond force. And as the struggle continued, the question stopped being whether the system would change. The question became who would survive once it did. When the Irish Land War entered its final phase, the main battlefield was no longer in the fields or villages. It was in the minds of the landowners. The old rules were still on paper, but reality had moved on. Rent was no longer a guarantee. Authority was no longer automatic. The question facing every landlord was simple: adapt or disappear. Those who clung to the past were the first to suffer. Some landlords kept pushing evictions, thinking fear would restore their control. But instead, they found themselves trapped in constant conflict. Their crops went unworked, legal and security costs soared. Their reputations collapsed. Owning land started to feel more like a burden than a privilege. Land that once represented power now required negotiation just to stay profitable. This was the moment many landowners completely misread the situation. They believed they were losing because their tenants had become rebellious. In reality, they were losing because the entire environment had changed. Economic pressure, political shifts, and social unity had created a new balance of power. Power hadn't vanished, had simply moved, and power that refuses to move eventually shatters. At the same time, another group of landlords made quieter, smarter decisions. Instead of resisting change, they studied it. They reduced rents voluntarily. They opened up communication with their tenants. Some offered long-term agreements that gave families more security. Others sold parts of their estates strategically rather than waiting for a total collapse. These choices felt uncomfortable, even humiliating to some, but they worked. Why? Because people resist force but respond to fairness. The landlords who adjusted their approach regained cooperation. Their fields were worked again. Their income stabilized. The tension eased. They gave up absolute control but preserved lasting influence. In psychological terms, they shifted from dominance to negotiation. Negotiation is far more sustainable, especially when trust has been broken. Soon, government reforms followed. Land Acts were passed that allowed tenants to buy land over time, permanently weakening the traditional landlord system. Ownership slowly transferred from large estates to the families who actually worked the land. The old model of distant authority faded away. Many large landowners sold their properties and left Ireland entirely unable or unwilling to adapt. For those who stayed, survival depended on their mindset. Landlords who saw the change as a betrayal suffered resentment and loss. But those who treated it as a strategy found new ways to remain relevant. Some diversified their investments. Others shifted from control to partnership. The transformation wasn't instant, but it was inevitable. The emotional side of this shift is often ignored. Landowners felt real fear. They had grown up believing their status was permanent. Watching that identity dissolve brought anxiety, anger, and confusion. We all tie our identity to our roles. When those roles disappear, it feels like a personal loss, not just an economic one. This helps explain why so many resisted change even when logic pointed toward adaptation. The tenants, meanwhile, experienced something profound: validation. The quiet resistance that began in small communities had reshaped national policy. The realization that ordinary people could influence power changed attitudes forever. Once people discover their collective strength, they rarely forget it. The Irish Land War became more than a conflict over rent. It became a lesson about authority itself. Authority only works as long as people believe it's legitimate. Once that legitimacy weakens, control requires either adaptation or force. And force is expensive and temporary. Adaptation, while uncomfortable, creates stability. By the end, the landlord class was transformed. Some estates vanished, others survived, but under entirely new rules. The winners weren't the strongest or the harshest. They were the most flexible. History often remembers conflicts as moments of destruction, but they are also moments of learning. The Irish Land War showed that survival in changing times depends less on power and more on awareness. The land didn't disappear. The people on it and their relationships simply changed. And the landlords who thrived were the ones who understood a difficult truth. Controlling people is temporary. Working with them lasts much longer. Thanks for watching.